So, of course, it only took 18 months from I made the introduction to this miniseries till I got around to make the actual episodes. In the meantime, Professor Jordan Peterson have begun to repeatedly address many of the same points as I made in the introduction. And while Jordan Peterson might be slightly too conservative for my personal taste, I do share a very large element of agreement with him, specifically when it comes to postmodernism, social justice, and compelled speech, and perhaps slightly less so when it comes to his own ideas about the social fabric, and I'm really not that thrilled about his religious views. However, a good point cannot be repeated often enough, especially when bad points are all over the place. So, in this episode, we're going to take a look at the staggering scientific illiteracy of social justice warriors, as well as their academic partners, the social justice instigators. And since social justice instigators hang around universities and give themselves titles like professor and PhD, titles that command rather high wages in the labor market, and being paid for either by taxes or by student fees, it really isn't unjustified to look closer at what it is these people claim to be science. Right, so if you never set foot at a university, you might think that a scientist is a person who does experiments with Bunsen burners and chemicals and does complicated math to figure out what is true in this world. And to some extent, that would actually be true. Except that type of research only takes place in what is usually referred to as the natural sciences. But the natural sciences is not the only science going on. There is also the social sciences and the humanities. Natural sciences would be things like physics, chemistry, astronomy, geology, and paleontology. Social science would be things like politics, economics, law, sociology, psychology, and postmodernists would claim that women's studies and gender, race, man-hating, and pronoun research belongs in this category as well. Finally, there's the humanities with fields like languages, literature, history, philosophy, music, and religion. But Bunsen burner research and chemical analysis isn't the right tool to do social science and the humanities. In these fields, you might have an expert in international politics, or in the late Roman Empire, or perhaps cognitive psychology. That type of research requires different methods to unlock. But while Bunsen burners and chemical reactions may not be very good tools in the social sciences and the humanities, it's a little bit different with math. You see, every scientist in the non-natural sciences are forced into a choice of methods from the start of any investigation. They must either use quantitative methods or qualitative methods. Quantitative methods are based on observable data that can be gathered under reasonably consistent and reliable conditions, and that are quantifiable in a form that makes them available for statistical analysis. But statistics is a sub-study under mathematics, and the foundation for statistics is probabilities. And that means that quantitative methods allows a scientist an idea about how probable a conclusion may or may not be. Qualitative methods, on the other hand, are methods that does not lend itself easily to mathematical analysis. Qualitative methods would be things like personal interviews and document or text analysis, the latter being most commonly used in the humanities, but it's also used among social scientists. Text analysis means reading and interpreting written material, and it's a method that relies heavily on the researcher's prior level of knowledge, on the accuracy of the material used, and the researcher's ability to be as objective and neutral as possible. Interviews are usually categorized in three different groups called structured, semi-structured, and open interviews. And a structured type of interview is usually considered the strongest type, as it uses rather rigid schedules with well-defined categories for answers. Semi-structured and open interviews are less rigid because the questions aren't defined as specifically as in a structured interview, and the answers doesn't have to come in the form of formalized answering categories. The strength of these methods are that they allow for the interview to develop dynamically and on the terms of the interviewee. This is to some degree a good thing, because things might be revealed during the interview that the researcher couldn't plan for in advance because the researcher simply didn't know about it. But these kinds of interviews are also really bad at collecting precise data that can be readily compared to other types of data. Until recently, personal interviews was really the only way to obtain data about people's views and behaviors. However, this is an excessively expensive way of gathering data because you need a researcher in a room with a respondent at all times. All three types of interviews had to be conducted this way originally, but then we had the dispersion of telephones, making it possible to make structured interviews in large telesurveys. And today, structured interviews are almost never done in person, as we would generally fare better by making maybe an online questionnaire. But the internet isn't very suited for semi-structured or open interviews, because the answers that comes back are mostly unique and requires a lot more work to bring into comparison with one another. That essentially makes them uncomputable and thereby not suited to perform large-scale investigations. They have their strength in a situation where you are interviewing an expert or a person with special insight or knowledge or experience. In semi-structured and open interviews, the interviewee can better express their special knowledge than they can in a structured interview. So all types of interview have their merits, but only one of them is really computable on a large scale. Quantitative methods are the strongest of all of these methods, and they have allowed for unprecedented progress throughout the last couple of 100 years. Mostly within the natural sciences, less so in the social sciences, but still to great effect. And in the humanities, most of the work does not involve quantitative work, but rather relies on the weaker qualitative methods. Now, quantitative methods could actually be used to greater effect in both the social sciences as well as the humanities, but for reasons we're about to discuss, they are underutilized. But it is true that the stronger quantitative methods that are so successful in the natural sciences are harder to use equally effectively in the social sciences, and they are least efficient in the humanities. This, of course, should not mean that just because it's harder to use stronger methods within your field, that you then allow yourself sloppy and unsupported thinking. In fact, because it is harder, it should require much more care and much more work before you actually say anything. And that leads us to the choice of methods made by the overwhelming majority of research done by postmodern Marxists. And since they have had no influence on how science is done within the natural sciences, postmodernism simply does not mean anything to these fields if it is not for mocking them, like in the infamous Sokal affair in the 90s. In the social sciences, postmodernism have had a much larger influence because it supplied a much needed refuge for the Marxists who looked like morons in the 90s after the Soviet Union collapsed. Especially sociology was a big hit, and later sociology branched out into the crazy tirade of pseudoscientific studies like women's studies, gender studies, race and social justice courses, etc., etc. But since postmodernism was born in the humanities, the spread is larger in the humanities than anywhere else. Lyotard was a Marxist philosopher. Foucault had a master's degree in philosophy and was a Marxist at least when he wrote the books that postmodernists so drool over. Pierre Bourdieu was a Marxist sociologist, and the Frankfurt School is nothing but Marxists, and they contributed to the wonders of postmodernism through the concept of critical analysis. All this means that postmodernism is basically exclusively using the weaker qualitative methods, and when they apply interviews as their method, they almost always use the hard-to-compute semi-structured and open interviews. You will occasionally see a study using structured interviews, but you will very rarely see a quantitative study using big data sets and applying actual statistical methods to understand the results. So why are postmodernists not using the best methods available? Well, you see, there's a rather big difference between quantitative and qualitative methods when it comes to acquiring the skills needed to perform them. And the difference is simple. Quantitative methods are really hard to acquire and really hard to perform. Qualitative methods are much easier both to learn and perform. And that is at the same time the main explanation for social justice instigators and social justice warriors being incompetent as fuck when it comes to statistics. In order to learn statistics, you have to stick at it for quite a while, and it's really hard to wrap your head around. It's not a subject that you can easily absorb by showing up for class to get the gist of the subject. Oh no, that's how you do gender studies. Statistics simply doesn't come that easily to you. But while something being difficult shouldn't be a wall impossible to climb for a person who wants to dress themselves in the peacock feathers of science, it appears to be a completely insurmountable task for basically the entire field of postmodernist. So if you don't know how to do the difficult methods, and you are either too lazy or too stupid to learn, then you would of course stick to the methods that are easier. And luckily, they have a ready-made excuse for not having to learn. Because statistics are based on logic, rationality, and actual observable facts. And we already know how those terms hold no significance for postmodernists, and in fact the base claim in postmodernism is that those concepts are just another way to oppress people. But to me, this is just a sign of utter incompetence. Because if you actually sit your ass down and learn statistics yourself, you'll discover a rather fundamental truth about statistics. Statistics doesn't know how to lie. Only people do. If you learn statistics, you'll discover that if you really want to know what is correct or not correct in this world, then statistics supplies the tools for you to discover if you are honest about what you are doing. And the reason why so much statistics in this world is bogus and false is not because there's something wrong with the statistical method. The problem is that people using statistics are either being ignorant or dishonest. Like the 1 in 5 campus rape statistics. What a piece of shit statistics supplied by utterly incompetent, motivated reasoners. Holy shit. But I just don't see why people should be forced to pay for this kind of incompetence, whether taxes are paying for them or students are paying through exorbitant tuition fees like in the US. Only a postmodern Marxist would ever find it reasonable to be paid some of the highest salaries in the public labor market for being really bad at their job. So if you're a young person considering what university you want to spend the next 3 to 5 years of your life at, I just cannot stress hard enough how important it is to completely avoid the universities who are infected with postmodernism. And I'm really serious. If you don't want your choice of university to end up being the biggest mistake of your life, you simply have to take a very close look at the university you want to go to. If the study you want to go to shows any sign of being into the postmodern craze of social justice, race baiting, anti-everything, and microaggression bullshit and the like, I just cannot signal how important it is that you go somewhere else. These people are not going to teach you skills that you can easily monetize in the labor market. And while that is not the only important consideration to do before choosing what to study, I urge you to understand that studying is the short part of life. Working is the long part of life. So since most students are going to leave university by the end of a bachelor or a master's degree, it's really important that choice of study and potential work opportunities are at least somewhat related. But all these universities are going to teach you is resentment, hatred, and poorly supported theoretical constructions that are often straight out in opposition to actual empirical evidence. Recently, Jordan Peterson said,
it's really disconcerting to someone who has children. And you know that your children are going to go there and they're going to be exposed
them to trade
to these
school.
ideas.
I think that, wow.
and I thought, no, not necessarily. And it's not that I don't like trade schools. In fact, I worked quite a bit of years at different trade schools throughout my work life. It's just that there are still lots of universities where postmodernism has a less prominent position than at the worst of them. Plus, there are some studies where postmodernism just has no influence whatsoever, like economics and some politics studies. So those studies are usually viable options too. But if you can't find a university that isn't fucked up by postmodernism close to you, and you don't want to move far away, it might just be that Jordan Peterson is right. Go to trade school instead. Because at least they will teach you skills that you can sell for an income. And unlike universities, trade school skills might actually help you if one day you want to start your own business. So please, for your own sake, stay clear of postmodern institutions. They will teach you things that are not only not true, but also likely make you emotionally worse off than when you entered. And despite what these people's business cards say, they are not scientists. They are essentially illegitimate politicians trying to push an ideology without having to go through the trouble of getting elected. There is just absolutely no way that that can turn out to be to your benefit. Unfortunately, methods are not the only scientific problems postmodernism gets itself into. So in the next episode, we'll take a look at why postmodernism is at odds with very rigid results in other parts of the scientific world.